Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Political Pulse. Today we'll be interviewing former Liberal Senator and Defence Minister Linda Reynolds with a focus on her work in preventing and raising awareness for orphan trafficking.
Linda Reynolds, thank you for coming to Scotch College and welcome to Political Pulse.
It's a pleasure to be here with you and thank you for your interest in this important topic.
Well, thank you very much again for coming on. We really appreciate it. Now, just to start, what was your journey into Parliament and what were some obstacles you faced along the way?
I came into Parliament 11 years ago after a long career in both the Australian Army, but also I'd worked in politics for many years as well. So I had a journey in two careers, which really set me up well for life as a senator. I think experience as an army officer is very helpful for politics.
What were some experiences that you had as an army officer?
There's so many over such a long career, but I think early on when I was an officer cadet and then when I was a young officer, particularly back then being a young female officer, sometimes there was a bit of resistance from some of the older blokes. But what I found is that if you treated people well and you explained what you wanted to do and why, that great Aussie spirit of a fair go really kicked in. So that was a really early lesson that I learned, that doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, that if you treat people well and you can make decisions, people will respect that, particularly when they understand why you're doing what you're doing. And that's what I found is a really important lesson for leadership, and also how to be resilient is really important too. How to roll with the punches, so to speak.
During your time in Parliament, you're obviously the Defence Minister. What were some of the main issues or challenges you aimed to address as your time as Defence Minister?
As Defence Minister, every day there's 100 briefs on your desk on issues that range from disciplinary issues, or in my case from alleged war crimes through to bushfires, dealing with COVID-19, the military response and support, to dealing with new agreements with our allies, the United States, Japan and others. So every day was different and every day there were big issues on my desk. But the best part was dealing with our servicemen and women, because as a servicewoman myself, I have a great respect for the work that they do, for their professionalism. So every day was different. But, one of the big challenges that we faced is that I had to redo our defence strategy, because obviously our world is less safe than it was a few years ago, with some of the, with China, with Russia, with Iran and North Korea, really looking at us and other democracies as enemies. So having to deal with that and consider what it means for our country is, it can keep you up at night.
And I imagine having that background in defence would have been really helpful, because I imagine you'd be able to relate and you'd be able to definitely use some of those strategies. You definitely have the knowledge for it.
That it was a big help, is having served, coming up from an officer cadet, then through to Brigadier General, working at Army headquarters and Defence headquarters. It really gave me an insight that most people coming into portfolios don't have.
Of course. Now, we'd like to move our questions to orphan trafficking. So what was your biggest motivation for becoming involved in addressing issues related to orphan trafficking?
Well, I came into this almost by accident. So I had done a course in the United Kingdom, a parliamentary course there, to teach MPs from across the Commonwealth about modern slavery, what it looked like and what sort of legislation you needed to bring in to combat it. Because what I discovered there is that there's more slaves today than there have been in human history. So, there's tens of millions of people, I think it's 80 million now, who are enslaved. And some of those are here in Australia. And Australians certainly cause slavery, the enslavement of others overseas. So I learnt about slavery then, and the same year I went to Cambodia. And when I asked Cambodian authorities, as a politician, you sort of say, what can we do to help and things like that. I was really shocked because what they told me was, stop your people coming here and supporting these so-called orphanages. They're not orphans. Their children have mostly been removed from their families to exploit. Most of them have parents and we have no oversight of them. So stop your people coming here and supporting them. So I was really shocked because I know a lot of Australians support what they think are orphans and orphanages because they've got good hearts.
Yeah.
So I came back to Australia and found that it was a real issue. That was 8 years ago, and I've been working on it ever since.
With orphan trafficking, how has it become? Has it just suddenly become way more common, or has it always been common in the background and we just haven't really known about it?
That's a really good question. It's actually something that's quite new, and how it's occurred is that the natural supply, if you think about supply and demand, the natural supply of orphans, genuine orphans, has been reducing significantly globally. But there's been an increased desire for people in Western countries, to support orphans. They've got good hearts, got some money, and want to do well. So I call it a 21st century form of slavery because people who will commoditise children have realised that if they traffic these children into homes, we won't do any due diligence. So if we see a charity and think, oh, that sounds really good, go and have a good experience with orphans and lots of Instagram photos of playing with orphans, supposed orphans, and giving money. You come back feeling good about it, and nobody is any the wiser that these kids are being exploited. So it's a new problem, but it's one that takes advantage of the fact that we don't check.
And you've discussed about, obviously, Australians where we want to support, we donate to charity in other places that are affected by this issue. But what does it look like domestically? What does orphan trafficking and modern slavery look like in Australia?
Well, again, another really good question, because one of the things that surprised me is just how prevalent slavery is here in Australia today. So slavery can look like somebody in a nail bar in one of our local shops, because we don't know where they've come from and how they've got to Australia. Somebody in a car wash. It's very prevalent on our farms, and particularly in horticulture across Australia, that people come in, they've had their passports taken away, they live in sheds out the back of farms, and in our care homes, because we don't have orphanages here anymore, but we do have care homes, and children do disappear from those homes and are exploited, and we don't have a really good, across Australia, a good way of checking. So it comes because our systems are not good in terms of looking after vulnerable children and adults.
And you talk about those systems that aren't quite where they need to be and they aren't quite fit for the problem. Is there legislative or actions you're taking to improve those systems, or is it sort of a technology aspect that we haven't quite caught up with?
It's not a technology problem, I don't think. There is legislation, so we do have modern slavery legislation, which I was the minister that brought that in. So that was one of the proudest moments in my career, is bringing that legislation in. But that's more focused on companies who buy goods from overseas, for them to check to see who's making those products. So that's what the modern slavery legislation is mostly focused on. But there is legislation here in Australia in the criminal code to stop people being trafficked into slavery, or to prosecute those. But if you don't know what it looks like, so if law enforcement doesn't know what it looks like or not looking for it and have no way of, one, finding it, and two, prosecuting it, we call it hidden in plain sight, because people can see it but they don't know what they're looking at. So there is legislation, but I think the real way to stop orphanage trafficking is because our demand to help poor children has created this form of child slavery and trafficking, is if we change our behaviour. So, you know, if your school or any other school or service club or church wants to help children, treat other people's children the same as we would want our children. So how would you want your brother and sister, you know, if you had younger brothers and sisters, to be treated? Would you want them to live in out-of-home care? Would you want them to have busloads of tourists coming and playing with them and, you know, not going to school? I mean, of course you wouldn't. So that's the first thing, is when you look to volunteer, think, how would we want our own children and our own family members to be treated? So instead of looking for group homes, orphanages, look for programs that help children stay with their families and, you know, support their schools and their families rather than supporting them being taken out of their homes.
Have these programs been successfully implemented in places like Cambodia, or are we still trying to work on that?
We're still trying to work on that because a lot of countries like Cambodia don't have really good child protection schemes, and they don't have systems of foster care, for example. So there's, you know, Australians and others who are working with Cambodian authorities, for example, and in another number of other countries to help them to do two things. The first is to find their children who are in these. In Cambodia, there was at least 500 of these orphanages. And so to find them and then progressively close them and either return the children with support to their own families and communities or find another family for them.
I imagine it's obviously had some effect, but has it been incredibly effective at eliminating domestic modern slavery, or are we still needing some more legislation to help reduce modern slavery?
I'm not sure we need more legislation. I think we need more public awareness and more awareness amongst, you know, the police forces, amongst welfare officers, amongst customs officers, you know, when they see people coming in and out, is actually to understand what they're looking for and what to do when they find it. And it's also about educating, you know, all Australians who do want to volunteer, is absolutely volunteer, but really think carefully and do your due diligence on the organisation and the program that you want to support. It's called being a smart volunteer.
And what's that process that needs to be taken to raise that awareness and to put in that process of educating others to get to that stage?
I think there's a number of ways, and I think what you're doing here today is a really, really great way to do it, because, you know, you've got a podcast, encourage people to listen to it, and to share social media. On social media, you know, do you know anybody who does support an orphanage? Did you know this? Have you, you know, checked and done these things? And what do you do if you find that it is a scam? Then what do you do? And then how do you look for better alternatives and ways to volunteer to keep children, you know, with their parents and to keep them in school and to give them the best start to life?
And for those people who we are raising awareness for, what is the best way to look towards finding those charities or those companies that are, you know, scamming people or they're using the money in non-beneficial ways? What's the best way to sort of figure out what are the good ones and what are the bad ones?
I always start from the perspective that if orphanages are not good enough for our own children, why are they good enough for other people's children? And just because they come from a poor family is not a good enough reason. So if you want to volunteer, start to think, who do I want to support? And if you want to support young children, get a good start in life, think about what charities are doing that. So if it's a charity that's providing support to children in schools to give them a better education, or to financially support the family so they can keep money coming into the home so that the child can stay at school, then, you know, there's a lot of charities that do that. So it's doing your research, it's looking for reputable charities, and charities are doing the work in a way that would be, if you're in that circumstance, how would you want someone? Would you want to be in an orphanage, or would you want to be with your family or a family?
So then in the future and in years to come, how are we thinking of addressing modern slavery?
Starting from the point is children thrive best when they're with a family and they've got stability, they've got love, and you don't have to have a wealthy family, but if you're in a family environment, you go to school, you get fed, and you've got a good opportunity, then that's how we do, I think, how we do best by children. Now, most of the children, between 80 and 90% of children in these so-called orphanages are not orphans. They've got at least one, if not two parents, who with support could look after them. So I come from the perspective that there's pretty much not a good orphanage. Is we should be looking to find home-based care and programs for children.
And we've looked on, what can individual Australians do to get involved, help out, but what can, say, our parliament do, our government do to help? Is it foreign aid, trade policies or diplomacy, or is it a more broader aspect that they need to look at?
That's a really good question, and the government did last year tighten the modern slavery legislation, but ultimately legislation is just a piece of paper if it's not enforced and if people don't understand it. So what are the things that you and your friends, your parents and your community, your school community can do? There's a number of things. So first of all is when you volunteer, we've talked about how you should go and pick the right charity for you and to make sure that it is legitimate. But secondly is slavery. So whenever you get, for example, a cheap bit of clothing off Temu, for example, or one of the on-site, stop and think, apart from, oh, wow, that's pretty cheap, that's cool, I'm going to click and order it now. Ask the question, how is it so cheap? Chances are that if you get something cheap online, particularly from China, it's going to be made with slave labour, because that's the only way you can make things so cheaply is if you're paying people almost nothing or nothing. And the same thing for new energy technologies, so solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, electric batteries. Most of those are manufactured in China, and most of those are all the way through the production process have the hands of slavery that touch them many times. So it's becoming far smarter and demanding. When you want to buy something, look into, where is it made and how was it made, and is there an alternative, a slavery-free alternative? And if not, use your voices to push the government to do more to make sure that what we're importing into Australia is slavery-free. It might cost a bit more, but what is the cost of a human life?
And with that stuff from Temu, so obviously we can't just shut down the factories that they use, but is there a way that the government can either reduce or stop completely those things being able to be imported into Australia to, say, reduce how much business they're actually making?
Yes, so the government certainly can do more, but I think the only way any government will do more is if people like yourselves get a movement going and, say back with, 2 voices, 10 voices, 1,000 voices, 100,000 voices, say we want you to do more to make sure that what we are buying here in Australia hasn't been made with the hands of slaves. So the government can be tougher, but they won't do that unless there's a movement, because people get pretty angry with them. Well, I like my cheap shirts and shorts and, everything else. So the government can't do it on its own, but people have a stronger voice, I think, than they realise. But again, what I've found, coming back to your question about what I've learnt in politics, is that everybody's voice counts. And the people who make the most change and get change with government are the people, doesn't matter what age you are, who come to politicians and come to governments using social media and other forms, but say this is the problem and this is what we want you to do about it. Because so many people come to governments and say, you need to do, get the finger out, you need to do something about this. Well, okay, what do you want us to do about it? And if we do it, are you going to get cranky with us because it'll have, it might increase costs, for your clothes. So it should be a partnership. That's where it works best.
But how come no one else has raised awareness about this before you? Because we haven't heard about modern slavery, especially child orphan trafficking, until recently.
I think because I became aware of it, I was a politician, so I was in a position to start talking about it and having a parliamentary inquiry into it. So I was in a fortunate position to do that. But I call this a perfect scam because, I know what I felt like when I came back from Cambodia. My head hurt and just thinking, this can't be true. This cannot be true. But it was. And what I found is when I talk to people who do support orphanages, either as volunteers or donors or tourists, when you think being a tourist to an orphanage, when you say it out loud, it sounds pretty awful, but many thousands of people are. But it's a perfect scam because people who are currently supporting them don't want to believe that instead of helping poor orphans, they've actually paid people, smugglers or traffickers, to traffic children into these orphanages. So the faces of orphans they've got, them playing with on Insta or Snapchat or wherever you've shared it is actually a trafficked slave and not a poor, a child that they think they're helping. And it's what's called dissonance. It causes great, angst for people and they don't want to believe it. So then they start bargaining and I get people saying to me, well, I've researched it and it is a thing, but I'm sure my orphanage is fine. The children are happy and smiling. And I say to them, well, can you speak their language? No. Can they speak English? No. Have you checked the organisation's paperwork? No. Do you know if they're registered? No. Do you know why they're allowing complete strangers to have complete access to children? We would never do that. We would no more have busloads of tourists, day after day playing with our children unsupervised. Can you imagine having tourists go through one of our kindergartens?
Yeah, it wouldn't be very popular at all.
No, it would not. So if it's not good enough for our own children, again, why is it good enough? Why do we think it's okay for us to pay for that to happen to other people's children? And that's a fundamental question that we have to be honest with in answering.
And in answering that is, something a bit different, but is it looking towards like what other nations have done? Like say other nations, say the US or the UK, I'd expect they'd have some form of this as well. Are there areas they've looked at, they've improved that Australia can take note of? Or
I think that all nations like ours who are more fortunate financially are having the same problem. So when we start talking to people in the United States, and I work with people in the United States, in Great Britain, in Holland, in Sweden, in Austria, in Japan, and many other nations, it's all the same. So they have university students who go and have tours to orphanages to help or to volunteer in. So everybody's at the same point. So it's a global problem that needs, all nations who are contributing to the problem to work together and to change the behaviours of our own good-hearted volunteers. And then it's also about helping the countries that have the orphanages. They're called receiving countries because they receive the money and the volunteers. It's helping them as I said, find the children, return them to their families, and provide financial support so that the children can stay with their families, and to stop this trade happening. So you start supporting other charities, and if you take the money away, then they'll close these facilities.
How are we then returning these children? Because I imagine they get taken into this horrible business and they're exploited. How are they then returned back to their families afterwards? Because I imagine there'll be a lot of disconnect. There might have been lots of years spread apart. How are we managing to resolve the family back together? And
that's a really insightful question, and it's one of the things that a number of organisations, like in Cambodia and in the Himalayas, across the Himalayas. So it's actually working with the government. So once you've identified that you've got a facility where children have been removed from their families, as you've said, is if they were there, they've been there since they're really young. They're given false papers, so they're called paper orphans because they're given false papers. So as they grow up, they forget who they are. They forget who they are, where they were from. So it can be really hard, not impossible, but is to get them to remember, well, what did your village look like? Can you remember anything about your past life? And sometimes they do, and there's enough clues to be able to go back to their villages and find their families. For those who can't, it's then a matter of working with the government to find or to set up foster care arrangements or other families for the children to go up with support.
so then those children who can't find their family homes because they've been so far removed, and how accessible is it to get them from, let's say, Cambodia to the US? Because I imagine you have to have a lot of certificates, a lot of paperwork saying who they are to be able to be adopted into US or Australian families. How are we bridging that gap? How are we making it easier?
Well, one of the things that I very strongly recommend and that advocates who work in this area say is do not send them out of the country. Look for families in their own communities, or so that they stay within their religious, cultural and language family. So what they've found over the years, and there's a big movement globally now, which I'm also involved in, is about the damage that's done to children who are inter-country adopted, because many of those have come from these facilities because they've got false papers. So, many of these children have been adopted overseas, and then they're finding out, through DNA tests and, going back through the paperwork over when they're adults, to find out that they actually do have living parents, or they did have, and they have relatives. So, and then they go back and find their cultural identity, and people who look like them, sound like them. And so there's a big movement now to say, well, are these children going to be any better off if they are adopted into Australia? Or would it be better actually keeping children in their own country with their own culture and in their own language, preferably with their family or another family? So in most cases, I would say they're better off finding families in their own communities.
Since we can't, we're struggling to move them out of the country because we don't want them to lose their cultural identity. What if they get put back in a family and then all of a sudden they then get put back into orphan trafficking again because their family can't support them, or the family just lose sight of them?
Well, that's part of the training for government agencies, for like Cambodia and many other nations, is how do you set up sort of good child protection agencies. We know here in Australia that we don't always do it very well, particularly for Aboriginal children here. So it can be a little tricky. But if you think about it, just because our system here is not perfect, nobody here is saying that we should send vulnerable, Aboriginal children overseas to families. We say, well, they should stay, kinship care. So, that's the same for other people's children. So it's actually about having a system that can, monitor the children, make sure that the family is able to take care of them. quite often in many cultures, if it's not the parents, aunties, uncles, grandparents would happily, look after the children with that bit of extra support.
And just to sum up our discussion on orphanage trafficking, the term commoditisation comes up a lot. You mentioned it earlier off camera, and it comes up a lot in articles and when we're raising awareness for it. What actually is commoditisation, and when people read it, what does it actually mean towards the topic? So it's not just that's there.
It's a hideous concept. And what commoditisation is, so commoditisation of children is when people see children and adults, but in this case children, as commodities, as a bottle of water, as a thing that they can exploit for money. So while there's a lot of amazingly good people in the world, there are sadly also a lot of criminals who just see children as a way to exploit, to make money for themselves. And once you see a child as a commodity, you will exploit them in the worst possible ways. So, for example, if you have children who've been trafficked and changed names in an orphanage and taught how to perform for tourists and volunteers, then when the doors close at night, they are still a commodity. And you can only imagine who they then allow to have unfettered access to young children. I mean, it is hideous. But that's what commoditisation is people who are so amoral and greedy that they see children and human beings as a commodity.
So I suppose the best way we're going to be able to deal with this rising problem is through raising awareness and legislation, but we really got to raise awareness in these countries where it's happening the most, like Cambodia and other countries.
Bali?
Really?
Mm.
Bali?
Oh, huge. There's a lot. There's probably hundreds of facilities in Bali that West Australians support.
Wow, and that's right in our backyard.
Well,
It is in our backyard.
Yeah,
there goes your innocent holiday to Bali.
Yes. And if people approach you there's service clubs, there's sporting clubs, there's schools who go to Bali, there's a number from here who go to a number of African countries, Cambodia, Laos, Central America, South America, full of them. And there's so many, good-hearted, West Australians, school principals and teachers and students and, Rotary clubs who think they're doing the right thing, but they're not thinking hard enough.
So is there anything that we can do as students other than this podcast to try and help stop this growing problem in society?
I think you can start a movement here in Western Australia amongst, lead the way in independent schools and then in schools here to raise awareness. Share this podcast. There's some good material online and some really good information. So share information, what it is. And, if you are supporting an orphanage, this is what you can do to change how you volunteer, but also to make sure the children you are currently supporting, what can you do to make sure that, they're not just suddenly dropped and abandoned, which would be the worst possible outcome. So you can start a movement here. You really can. You've got, every student here between you, you've got, big networks on social media, and you can share information, start an action, and put pressure on politicians here in Western Australia and in Australia to say we need to do it differently here.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to Political Pulse and for sharing your stories and your knowledge on all of orphanage trafficking and your time in the army and everything. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you so much for your interest. And let's start a movement here.